Hi, it's Wendy again. I just watched an interesting documentary and I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. Um, Regardless of the fact that I look like crap, and I've actually been sick for the past month. And I might start coughing at any time. Anyways, the documentary I watched was called 1929, and it was done in 2009, but it's still really relevant and maybe even more relevant at the present moment than it was at the time. It was made, it came out actually right around the time of the US recession. And the topic is sort of how the US economy got out of control in the 20s, how that resulted in the crash in 1929. What were the results of that? Like, what did depression mean? How did it affect people on the top, people in the middle, people on the bottom, and how did it affect the economies across the Atlantic? Because I've often wondered about, well, how come, what happened in the U.S., how did that end up creating such havoc in countries like Germany? So it was a really good documentary, and it was created with a combination of historical clips, like all kinds of famous footage of people standing in bread lines, and also scenes from the stock exchange madness at the time of the crash, and speeches by Coolidge and Roosevelt, and scenes of Hoovervilles and Okies and stuff. But in between and all during it, there was commentary from actually really good, well selected, well versed economists and historians. Um, I have actually found that the channel where I'm watching this documentary, CuriosityStream, has documentaries that are at a much higher standard than what you might be used to watching on, say, the History Channel. And I mean the History Channel as it is now. Some of their experts are just kind of bogus and random, and on this one they had, like, Howard Zinn was on it, and talking a lot, and he's the author of History of the United States. There was also a Nobel Prize winner for economics talking, so this is not like a nobody assistant professor type of person. And they had really interesting commentary, and it also didn't follow the standard narratives that I had heard. Like, for example, when they got to the part where they were talking about the New Deal, they're like, hey, there were a lot of great parts of the New Deal, and then there were parts of it that were just, ridiculous and didn't work. So, for example, they talked about how all different sectors of the economy improved except for agriculture, and then talked about, missteps by the Roosevelt administration to address agriculture and how they actually made it worse. And another time when the administration misstepped and created a little depression or recession within the depression, because they miscalculated, I think, settings, some, I don't know, interest rate or something like that. And then they had to do a reset, and they did recover. It turns out from watching this that I actually know quite a lot already about the economics of the 20s and 30s and the New Deal and the Depression, and I just know that from years and years of watching documentaries and reading and learning a lot about stuff like the Works Progress Administration from all this research I've done into Art Deco and 1930s civic projects, and books like 1939, The Lost World of the Fair, about the New York World's Fair of 39 and 40. So I knew a lot of this, which impressed me because I'm not an economics expert, or I don't have a history degree, but I'm watching this saying, and right before they said something, I'd say, yeah, but the next thing is, and then the talking head would say it. So that was good, and I think anyone who is into this topic would see reinforced things they knew, but you'd also get an opportunity to learn about things that have been sort of glossed over or haven't been impressed on those of us who are living now in the 21st century. A couple things I learned, which I kind of knew but I didn't really know the details, is number one, you might know about the bonus army, and I knew about the bonus army. And this is basically millions of veterans who came out of World War I and found themselves like in a, just unemployable or in bad situations. And they were all had this hope that they were going to receive this bonus, which they had been promised. And they got really impatient at the time of the crash, and afterwards in the Depression. They said, where's this bonus? This was, 10 plus years after the end of the World War I. And they decided to somehow launch a protest, and, thousands and thousands of men and also their families converged on Washington, D.C., and I knew that. And they demanded that their bonus, they said, we can't wait. And, they could argue, hey, this is a kind of economic stimulus because you're talking about people don't have money to spend. Well, why don't you stimulate us by giving us this money, which would allow us to, feed our families and get clothes and maybe get an apartment or something instead of living in Hoovervilles. And Congress rejected their appeal, and, some of them went home, but then a lot of them stayed. And what they did is they constructed a Hooverville, like a big, shack and tent village, on the Mall of Washington. And I knew this too. I know that, Central Park was full of Hoovervilles, and they were just everywhere because, people had been evicted, and they didn't have anywhere to go, and there wasn't any social security network at the time, or social safety net. So anyways, they construct this Hooverville, which is, incredibly embarrassing and incredibly visible. It's right, by the Capitol, by the White House, all that. Everyone could see it. It's on the newsreels. And Hoover, Herbert Hoover, was nearing the end of his term and decided, okay, we're gonna put a stop to this. We're gonna break this up. Kind of similar to how governments have, say, intervened in massive strikes. Okay, but the way that he did this was by getting his generals to launch a military strike against this group of not just veterans, but women and children. It's something you'd see in China today, or in South America. You don't think like this happened in the U.S., but he ordered the military and said, get them out of here. So literally, like, troops came in with guns and horses and tear gas and attacked this group and started breaking down all their shacks and everything that they had, and people died. And then what was the kicker on all this is that the men who were in charge of this operation were Douglas MacArthur and Ike Eisenhower, who became, massive heroes of World War II and the Korean War. Well, MacArthur. And they took this action event against veterans, which, was something that reverberated across the country and pretty much like sealed Hoover's doom. He was finishing his first term, and like his name was mud after that. So that action was among the many reasons that Roosevelt won in a landslide in 1932. So there's that. And the second thing I learned, which I didn't know, despite the fact I know a lot of German history, particularly 30s and 40s, and everything having to do with Nazism and fascism, that's another hobby of mine besides Art Deco. So I found out through this documentary that I think it was under Hoover. It could have been under Roosevelt early on, but I sort of think it was under Hoover. In the desperation of the Depression, they were looking to get capital, they, being the federal government. And so they said, hey, we've loaned Germany a whole bunch of money, which they needed because their economy had been shit all through the 20s. And then they, like a bad landlord or loan shark or something, said, hey, we want your money. We want it right now. And Germany's democracy and whole economy had been pretty shaky around that time, and getting that money from them and shaking them down was a factor that really tipped the country towards fascism and towards that act of electing Hitler. Because suddenly they got plunged into the same depression that the U.S. was in. And it's true, France and the U.K. were also had also been sucked into depression, but Germany got hit super, super hard. And this created a sense of vengeance against the U.S. and feeling like besieged, and everything was unfair, and everything had been unfair since the Treaty of Versailles. And certainly this is something that Hitler talked about all the time and stoked up. All the Nazis stoked this up, everything is so unfair. Our country is the greatest country, and we're being punished like this. And then they also fed into that whole anti-Semitic trope, which they said, hey, the U.S. economy tanked because of all these reckless bankers who are Jewish. So they're, saying Wall Street is run by Jews. Jews did this to their economy, and then in turn, they came around and demanded this money from Germany. So we're suffering because of the Jews. And I've seen firsthand propaganda that was produced at this time, like posters that said, Germany is in trouble and we're all suffering because of Jews. And, talking about, the Jewish conspiracy. So because they got rocked by being faced with having to pull back this loan, and then because of the general anti-Semitism and the fact that there was resentment already that had never gone away, there's my cough, since World War I, Germany elected the Hitler Hindenburg ticket in, I think it was 33, so, just after Roosevelt was elected. And they got a margin of 33%, whereas I think Hitler had tried to run in 1928 or something, and he got like 3%, or the Nazi Party got about 3%, and suddenly they got up by 33%. And one of the other things that the historian mentioned is a lot of times it's said, it's the poor people of Germany who are suffering, who rose up and voted in huge numbers for Hitler. But they argued that it was actually members of Germany's middle class that voted for Hitler because they had been hit really hard, just like in the U.S. The middle class was hit really hard because they got into this whole, hype of the 1920s, and they got, really high off the money, and they did speculation and everything. And then when the Depression hit, they sank down again. They were like, it's going to go up and up and up and up. We're going to become millionaires. And then they were back to being, lower middle class or whatever. So they saw someone who was telling them, hey, this is really unfair. And they said, yeah, it is really unfair. And, then they had someone who was promising to, get Germany what it deserves and, punish the people who made this happen, i.e. Jews, and decadent people. And that's the way the country went. Whereas I guess some of the poorer people of the country, they had been poor all along, so they didn't quite have this. And of course, they did vote. They did vote for Hitler too. And then there was all the stuff where the Nazis actually formed coalitions, as I recall, with like communists and socialists who Nazis actually despised, but they formed coalitions with them so they could get votes and they could form blocks in the Reichstag. And then once the Nazis had firm power, they took all those people, kicked them out of government, and put them in concentration camps like Dachau. So I knew about all those other things, but I didn't know about how some of that was instigated by the U.S. and pulling back those loans and, tipping stuff over. So that's just me sharing the knowledge and also recommending this documentary, which again is called 1929. It was released in 2009. I had never heard of it, but I recently got a subscription to CuriosityStream, which was an amazing channel. It's an app. I assume you can also get it through the web. And it's not that expensive, and it's a repository and a channel for really high quality documentaries. Basically, what I heard is it's producers who can't get main networks like the History Channel or even PBS to air their stuff. I don't know, it's not commercial enough, it's not sexy enough, whatever, but it's really fine stuff. And it's very serious kind of stuff. And I've been sort of sucking it up since I subscribed to it. I've watched several really great series that I've watched and said, "Wow, it's a shame this stuff couldn't be on TV," or that it has such a limited audience. So I urge you to see this movie if you can somewhere else. It's called 1929, and you check out CuriosityStream.